Oh, this is it, you guys. This is the last week of our book, and it's so good, and you're not going to believe how it ends. This is chapter 18 called The Battle. Ragweed's earring saved her. So powerful, so swift was Mr. Oacax's descent that he pushed a wave of air before him and caused the earring to flutter. The flutter felt like the tap of a tiny finger on Poppy's ear. She felt it and whirled. At the last possible second, she saw the owl coming and made a leap to safety. The next moment, however, she realized she had made a terrible mistake. She had leaped not back among the corn, but farther onto the open road. Mr. Oacax was now on the ground, blocking her way to the field. She spun toward the forest. In a second, the owl was up in the air and down on the other side. Once again, he had blocked her way. "Not so smart as all that, are ya?" he sneered. "Well, I don't compromise with what I want," he told her. "And what I want is you never getting home alive." He made a sudden darting movement to the left. Poppy jumped to the right, but Mr. Oacax was ahead of her. Just as quickly he shifted back toward her so that Poppy was forced to halt herself clumsily, and there she stood, flat-footed, panting, not sure which way to go. The owl, towering over her, laughed. "I told you what would happen if I caught up with you again, didn't I? But this time you won't have that fat porcupine to help you." And he made a snap at her with his beak. Mr. Oacax's mention of Aerith was the reminder Poppy needed. She reached down and yanked the quill from her sash, then held it before her like a sword. At first, Mr. Oacax blinked. Then he snickered. "Ha! You don't think one of his quills is going to stop me, do you?" "That owl on the barn," Poppy panted between hard breathing, "is just a fake. You've been frightened by a fake owl." Mr. Oacax's beak dropped open. He hesitated, and in that moment Poppy sensed she could have gotten away. But she couldn't resist another taunt. "You're not an owl. You're a chicken," she cried in triumph. For an instant, the two of them, owl and mouse, confronted each other. Then a look of terrible rage passed across the owl's face. Poppy knew she made another mistake. She'd lost her chance of escape. Now there was nothing he wouldn't do to kill her. She would have to fight him. And here comes the battle. Who do you think's gonna win the battle? Trembling, she flourished the quill. In response, Mr. Oacax spread his wings, then beat down hard with them upon the road. They threw up a cloud of dust. It was hard for Poppy to breathe, much less see. She took a step back, only to hear a sound behind her. Confused, she turned. Hidden by the dust, Mr. Oacax had overleaped the road, and he was behind her once again. From there, he made a slash at her with his beak. Poppy struck out with her quill. Seeing the quill and realizing the danger to his eyes, the owl pulled back. He glared at Poppy. He snapped his beak. Poppy stared back, grim-faced, gasping for breath, waving the quill before her. "If it takes the whole night, I'll wear you down," Mr. Oacax hissed. "All it takes is one mistake on your part. Then you're done. Finished." And he made a forward feint. Poppy jumped back. Mr. Oacax struck again. This time it was not with his beak, but with his talons. Poppy, quill up, dodged the talons with a quick sidestep, but she knew her only hope was to get into the corn and hide. Otherwise, the owl would overpower her. Making sure of her footing, she began to back toward the forest. And just as she had hoped, Mr. Oacax leaped up and landed between her and the trees. It was then that she raced for the corn. Mr. Oacax was just as fast. Grasping her strategy, he barely touched earth when he took a flying hop forward to block her way. He advanced wildly now, snapping and snarling. In response, Poppy slashed wildly with her quill. Once she struck out at the owl's face, but only hit his feathers. But though the blow glanced off harmlessly, it served to infuriate him. Mr. Oacax, closing in, darted his head in and out, side to side. Poppy was bewildered. Then the owl turned briefly away from her. In a flash, she made a successful rolling dive under his wing. Finally, she was behind him, on the corn side of the road, and she started to run. He turned his head in a complete half circle, saw her, and spun his whole body around. His right wing extended full length. The wingtips struck Poppy, a glancing blow to her head, and down she tumbled, landing on her back in the dust. Seeing his advantage, Mr. Oacax pounced, beak open, tongue out, hissing. Poppy whipped the air with the quill, and the tip of it pricked the owl's tongue. He screamed in rage and jumped back. Poppy had just enough time to regain her feet. Once more she faced him, quill ready. Mr. Oacax, stung, pressed forward, now this way, now that, with his head bobbing, weaving, viciously snapping with his beak. She was getting exhausted, and she was forced to give ground. She crumpled to her knees. It was the moment the owl had been waiting for. With a powerful kick, he thrust his left claw, talons spread wide, at Poppy's head. Poppy saw the claw coming, and using all of her strength to grip the quill, she held it up with both paws to protect herself and jabbed it into Mr. Oacax's claw as it came down. The owl gave a great squawk, fell back, and began to roll around violently. Fearful of losing her quill, her only weapon, Poppy pulled on it with all her might. But the barbs had caught, and she couldn't get the quill loose. She was being dragged and bumped along. Mr. Oacax, screeching and flapping his wings wildly, flew into the air. And before Poppy knew what was happening, she too was in the air. She did tell herself to let go of the quill, but by the time the thought was whole, it was too late. They were too high up, and to drop from that height Mr. Oacax had already reached meant falling to a certain death. There was nothing to do but hang on. Mr. Oacax, squawking, hissing, flew like someone possessed. Up, down, and around he went, making loops and stalling dives, climbing and twisting, anything and everything to work the quill from his claw. But the more he flexed and twisted, the more the barbs worked themselves into his claw, causing even more excruciating pain. And Poppy hung on. So look at this picture. Poppy used the quill and struck out at Mr. Oacax's claw, and it's now sticking into his claw, and the barbs are not allowing it to come out. And there she is on the other end, and he took off and is flying, and she's being dragged along. Oh my. The fact that Mr. Oacax was dragging a claw, and from that claw dangled a mouse, greatly impeded his flying. His flight path became increasingly wild. In his desperate desire to rid himself of pain, Mr. Oacax ceased to look where he was headed. That means he wasn't paying attention to where he was going. Violently, he plunged toward the cornfield. Once over it, he lowered his left claw, and that meant Poppy, deliberately thumping it and her along all of the corn stalks in the hope that the quill would be released and jerked out. Poppy was being battered. But each time she decided to release her hold on the quill, the owl surged forward, causing her to cling to it more than ever. Knowing she could not take much more, Poppy tried to see ahead. Mr. Oacax was skimming low over the corn tops, but when he passed beyond them, he dropped toward the ground. "Let go," Poppy told herself. "Let go." But she was feeling so groggy, her own muscles wouldn't respond. Then she saw what the owl was aiming for. Any ideas? The salt lick, and he was picking up speed. In his madness, he was preparing to strike his claw on the salt lick. Poppy had wits enough to sense that if she struck the hard salt, it would be the end of her life. "Let go! Let go!" she cried to herself again. And this time, she did. And down she fell. As she did, Mr. Oacax first rose, then dropped, and totally out of control, he slammed into the salt, head on. So great was the blow that the salt shattered, while the owl went tumbling head over tail in an explosion of feathers. After 3 flips, he flopped down like a sack of potatoes onto the ground. As for Poppy, she had landed on the grass. For a moment she lay there, stunned and confused. She looked up into the sky but saw nothing. Then she looked across the lawn and saw him, Mr. Oacax, laying on his back, perfectly still. His claws were drawn up over his chest, slightly curled. The quill still stuck out of the left one, and scattered about among the feathers were chunks of salt. Poppy stumbled to her feet. She took a wobbly step or two toward the cornfield. Then she stopped and looked back. Mr. Oacax had not moved. She stared at him. Slowly, not sure if she should believe what she was thinking, she crept closer to the fearsome owl. After every few steps, she paused, looked, sniffed. Still, there was no movement. You see him here? Here he is, laying on his back. That's his claw. And the quill is sticking out of it. And you see the big white chunks? That's all the salt from the salt lick that was shattered and fell to the ground. Oh boy. Close to Mr. Oacax's head now, Poppy stopped again. The owl's great eyes were wide open, staring up into the sky. His tufts of feathers were bent. His beak was open. And as Poppy watched, it snapped closed. "Mr. Oacax?" No answer. She took a step closer. "Mr. Oacax?" His head turned slightly, and for a moment his eyes seemed to focus on her. "Sometimes," he murmured, "sometimes I wonder why I bother to protect you." And with that, his beak made a final clack shut. His eyes closed. Poppy knew it then. Mr. Oacax was no longer alive. Wow. What a good chapter. Can you believe it? Oh. All right, chapter 19 coming up next. Only 2 chapters left, guys. All right, I hope you're enjoying. Bye-bye.